Welcome back, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. Moving on to our second official meeting together. We're going to be heading through the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook by Arielle Schwartz. There are 60 different themes and activities in this book. I'm going to try to get us through 2 to 3 themes per video. We're going to go in order. We're not going to skip around. I believe during our original time together, we covered probably, 3 to 4 of them. So there might be some repeat once we get through the entire book. In the meantime, I want to focus on the first 3 themes. And the first 3 themes are mindfulness, resilience, and the 3 phases of good and traditional trauma-informed, evidence-based treatment. So while this is not going to be any type of psychotherapeutic video, we are going to move together on this journey, learning about how certain practices can help in the midst of dealing with trauma. You all are dealing with a very specialized type of trauma called traumatic grief. So it falls into both the grief neighborhood and the trauma or traumatology neighborhood. These activities are no less valuable because what they really serve to focus on is the post-traumatic stress response that I'm sure several of you probably are still experiencing with respect to hypervigilance when you're out in the world. You are no doubt experiencing sensory responses, smells, season, weather can be a trigger for you. Certain dates can be a trigger, words, even just thinking that everything's fine, and out of nowhere, you see a commercial on television or hear a song on the radio, and you're instantly brought to your knees or just reminded of your person. We're going to talk about fractured memories and how to reintegrate those as the 3rd phase of therapy goes, when we eventually get there later on in our book. Moving on from the 3 themes, the mindfulness, resilience, and 3 phases, is how these meetings are going to go. And I think, you obviously are going to be able to go about the meetings in a way that works best for you. My recommendation is that after I talk about each theme, there's an activity to stop and read the activity and spend a few minutes doing a journal response. Journal response can be a narrative form, it can be stream of consciousness, it can be bulleted. It is my recommendation to get the most out of the material in this textbook that you actually do the journaling work. I know there's some of you in the room right now, I'm looking at you, you know who I'm talking to. You don't like to do the journal part, but it really is important because you don't have to take my word for it. There is science-backed research that says when you correlate the handwriting process, the brain is able to do a more efficient job of processing the material and information. So there actually is evidence to show that when you engage with the material through writing out, not clickety-clack typing on a computer, but actually handwriting out a response to a journal prompt, there is actually a psychotherapeutic response, beneficial response. So it is of my opinion that once we get through each theme, and we're only going to do 3 today, but in between each theme, so let's go theme, activity, theme, activity, theme, activity. That way, when you go into your dyads and triads, you actually have material right in front of you. Then later throughout the month, you go back and you reflect on that information, material, thoughts, and processing before moving on to the next 3 themes. That is the goal. Now, if you want to do less writing in the meeting, then just for this meeting, you write during the activities. But for your next meeting, we will do the next 3 themes. And it will be your responsibility / homework in the next month to complete those activities so that when you come into the next group meeting, what will be discussed is the video that I present. And then once I'm finished doing my presentation in the video, then you already have the written responses completed and you go straight into your dyads and triads to discuss what you have actually already written down. So there's two options. Option one is you watch the video, you pause, you respond to the activity, you start the video again, you watch the next theme, you pause it, the next activity, so on and so forth. Then you stop and go out into your dyads and triads to discuss the material. Option two is you know the next three themes that are coming, you read them, you do the activity, and then you come back to the meeting class where you listen to the video presentation, stop, shut that down, and then take what you already have written and go into your dyads and triads. So you spend less time writing in the actual meeting and more time listening and talking. Those are your two options. Regardless as to which format you choose, it is my opinion that you actually literally respond in writing to each of the prompts. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So the first theme is the invitation. And the idea of this theme is working on daily mindfulness practice. Some of you, I'm sure most of you have heard mindfulness or being mindful of your thoughts, of what you're doing, as a type of way of being, Zen or centered or whatever. Mindfulness is actually a psychotherapeutic modality associated with cognitive behavioral therapy. In its simplest form, mindfulness is a practice of being especially attuned or in tune with your thoughts and your behaviors. Why this is significant to trauma is because your brain essentially is somewhat hijacked by the traumatic incident itself. What can pose as a special difficulty is if you as an individual have struggled with trauma or traumatic events prior to this specific incident with the suicide completion of your loved one. If you have a history of trauma or traumatic experiences or a high ACE score, that's ACE, I will talk about that later, which essentially means adverse childhood experiences, which could be divorce, parental incarceration, loss of a parent through death, or permanent separation. I'm drawing a blank. Financial hardship, physical abuse, sexual abuse. There's a series, it's like 10 or 12. I can't remember the exact number. You can actually Google ACE scores, ACE, or an ACE quiz to find out what your number is. The higher your number is, the more likely you are to have certain sicknesses like certain cancers and certain things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. Those are usually utilized as predictors for those types of physical health outcomes, but we also now know they are also predictors for things like this. When you have traumas later in life, overcoming them, getting through them, integrating them, knowing how to deal with them and what to do with them becomes much more difficult, because essentially the argument is you were robbed of the normal, stable trajectory, having had those adverse childhood experiences, compared to an individual who has not had those or who has not had as many as you have. The statistics of like hundreds of thousands of individuals, it's one of the biggest research projects in United States history. I think it's actually now international, that at least human beings in the West have at least 2 on average ACE scores, ACE occurrences, adverse childhood experiences. If it is the case that you have 4, 5, or 6, and you are also in the midst of dealing with losing your loved one to a traumatic event, it's going to be much more difficult for you to process the experience, even as a full-grown adult, especially if you have not been able to have the opportunity or circumstance to process those prior traumas. So when we talk about mindfulness, it will be especially challenging for that individual to focus on or be aware of their thoughts and behaviors. But it takes practice. And the book does an excellent job of saying, hey, give yourself a break, give yourself some time, and just practice. It's like any other skill. But the power of mindfulness goes back to one of the first conversations we had in our very first group setting, which was knowing how your thoughts are impacting you. Are these thoughts that you're having for you or against you? Go back and reflect that toxic conversation, the toxic / authenticity conversation. Is this experience that I'm having right now in the grocery store, these thoughts about getting, the certain kind of rye bread that my person loved, and I'm ruminating now on a story that is just breaking my heart, and it's not necessarily a good story, or whatever it happens to be. Are these thoughts for me, or are these thoughts against me? Are these thoughts moving me forward in healthy grief, or are these thoughts holding me captive to toxic grief? Mindfulness, in a nutshell, is metacognition, thinking about your thinking. How are these thoughts framing my outlook right now toward my grief recovery? Mindfulness serves to lower your cortisol levels. It serves to feed healthy neurotransmitters, and it helps you learn how to stabilize your emotions in a way that outside of mindfulness can go awry and become a bit of a wild animal to try to contain. The last thing I want to say about mindfulness is you can't get rid of something without replacing it with something else. This is according to not just traumatology, let's say, and integrating new thoughts and memories, but also in substance use circles and in general life practices. When something's taken away, think of a toddler or a pre-toddler, right? A little small child who still has a binky. When you take that binky or that pacifier away from that baby, that child, and they're not ready for you to take it away, what happens? Right? All hell breaks loose. So in the same way, you need to have something to put into that thought gap. So you get through the metacognition space, mindfulness. I'm thinking about my thinking. This thought is not for me. Therefore, I need to hold that thought accountable to a truth point. A truth point for me would be scripture. A truth point for me would be something powerful from a devotional book. A truth point for you might be some poem, some line, some piece of sage advice that you were given at some point in your life that really served to move your heart in a healthy direction. Find those truth points. And when you come across those moments where you're realizing this thinking is not for me, this thinking is against me, move into that next thought of positivity, not Pollyanna, not rainbows and lollipops, but something that is true, something that you hold to be true. An example for me would be if I'm ruminating on something dark and negative, let's say about my husband's passing, I might say something like, God is good. God is for me and he loves me. He's never going to leave me and he's never going to forsake me. Because God is within me, I will not fall. These are just encouraging scriptures, encouraging messages to remind me that I am not alone, even though I'm a widow. So, end point, mindfulness. Thinking about your thinking. Are these thoughts for me or against me? You make a decision. If they're for you, great. Keep on that road. If they're against you, hold them accountable to a truth point, but you have to have one in your back pocket ready to use in order for this practice to be effective. Go ahead and stop the video now and look at your journal prompt and respond to it. It is on page 5, mindfulness of the moment. Go ahead, have someone read that out loud, and then everyone please respond to it. All right, so this next theme has to do with understanding resilience and post-traumatic growth. Just the term growth, remember, keep in mind, it's moving forward. You're not bulldozing. You're not being asked, especially in this textbook. And if you are working with a counselor or psychotherapist and they're trying to force or push you through getting past or moving through or overcoming your grief, break up with them, because really the idea, especially in the space of traumatic grief, is not to override, power through, or get over your grief. It really is to integrate it. You might come across a therapist or counselor who says, I'm going to help you get through it, which might be an innocent language thing. That's fine. But make sure that you are on the same page with respect to not necessarily getting through the experience and therefore getting past it and it getting behind you, but rather taking the experience, allowing an integration of the experience to happen that benefits you so that moving forward, the experience serves you instead of having you be subservient to the experience. And by that, I simply mean you are no longer going to be held hostage to the experience. It will be something that moves you forward in your life and that will actually help you live life to its fullest, despite the extreme pain and suffering that is associated with traumatic grief. So the concept in this section of the book, this is our second theme, is understanding the differences between realistic optimism and mindfulness. Not necessarily understanding the difference, but understanding their connection. That's what I meant to say. Understanding the connection between mindfulness and realistic optimism. So the book does, again, a really good job of describing that what it is not, what realistic optimism is not. What I want for everyone in the room to hear is that some people might incidentally misconstrue the concept of realistic optimism with, I have to be optimistic all the time, or I can't be realistic about what's actually happening. Anything that asks you to be inauthentic is not good. The world forces grievers into a space of inauthenticity for mere survival. And you all know what I'm talking about. At some point, you had to go to the grocery store. At some point, you had to go to work. At some point, you had to get in your car and go to the dentist or a doctor's appointment or have a conversation with someone you really didn't want to have a conversation with and act like everything was okay, or at least good enough for you to be doing those things in the first place. And you know, things were absolutely not good enough in those moments, but you had to power through and get those things done regardless, because life does not stop for trauma and life does not stop for grief, and life certainly does not stop for traumatic grief. So you were automatically put into a situation where you had to be inauthentic. That is not what optimistic, realistic optimism is. Realistic optimism is, this is hard, but I can do this. This is hard, but I am doing this. And it's remembering that it's how we choose to be, the state of our existence, how we choose to experience the world. I read recently, life is 10% of what, and I've had read it before, but I wrote it down because I'm like, I want to remember this. Life is 10% what happens to us and 90% what we make of it, how we conceptualize it, what sense we make of it. And so traumatic grief is no different. Grief is no different, but it comes down to the beliefs that we have about whatever incident took place. So in psychotherapy land, we can call them maladaptive thoughts. We will call cognitive distortions under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm thinking it, that's the cognitive piece, and therefore I'm going to behave in a certain way. That's the behavioral piece. So cognitive behavioral, you think it first and then you do it. That's the theory that it's based on. So the idea is then, if we start to have these stories that we ruminate on, they can become a little twisted, right? So in the case of parents having lost a child to completed suicide, unfortunately, what happens is the parent takes on pretty much 100% of the blame and responsibility. There are definitely points of clarity where you know you're not responsible, but it's not what you believe. And we live out what we believe, not what we know. And that becomes a problem for story building. So the idea with realistic optimism is to take reality, and instead of twisting it dark, we twist it light. And the idea also then is to follow up with action. And so it's not just about what I'm thinking, but it's then making a choice of how you will behave. Connecting that to mindfulness. Mindfulness is an action point. Mindfulness is moving forward in the action. So I'm in pain and I'm suffering, and life is really, really dark pretty much every day. A week after it happened, a month after it happened, 5 years after it happened, 10 years after it happened, I'm still in pain. But the idea is by year 10, 15, even year 5, even year 3, getting to the next step and the next step and the next step. That's action. Coming to these meetings once a month, that's action. That's making a cognitive choice to do a behavior that is for you and not against you. So realistic optimism focuses on the growth mindset moving forward. And that happens through being mindful and then taking action on those mindful steps. So what I want you to do right now is have a conversation. I'm sorry, no, you're not going to have a conversation. You have read the resilience section. You've read the realistic optimism section. And the second activity on page 8 is reflecting on resilience. And in this activity, it wants you to focus and reflect on your own resilience and how far you've already come. It has you doing some other things, but I really want you concentrating on how far you've come from when the incident happened to where you are right now. So take a minute and look at your text, read over the prompt, and please respond if you haven't done so already. So the final section talks about the 3 phases of trauma recovery, trauma therapy. We use similar phases in substance use and addiction recovery. Traumatic grief and trauma are the same. I think this is pretty much the gold standard. The 3-phase therapeutic process is pretty much the gold standard in traumatology, which is the section of psychology that specifically treats with trauma. If you're watching this video, you have experienced trauma. So the gold standard looks like this. I'm going to read from my notes here. So the first step is safety and stabilization. And the idea is to overcome dysregulation. So when you first got the news, I'm going to say at least the first year of your experience. So from the very first moment you were informed that your loved one had passed away from suicide to I'm going to say at least the first year, possibly even the second year, that whole time, that 12 to 24, sometimes longer, 36 months is really just trying to achieve emotional stability. So hear me again when I say 1 to 3 years. Now there's no actual, it could be 1 to 5 years. There really is no timeline. It's been my experience that things start to, I don't want to say like normalize, but you've had enough practice by the end of year 3 to kind of fake it till you make it, kind of white knuckle it. And so you can almost convince yourself that you're surviving and you're doing it, but you almost have a constant zzz, like a constant buzzing happening inside your being. And there's moments still where you are trying to be calm and as relaxed as you can, but there's almost an internal vibration almost a literal internal vibration that and if you do sit still or you have any moment of complete stillness, it almost feels like you're going to have like an anxiety attack or a panic attack. So the first phase of treatment is to overcome that dysregulation, and it's indefinite. You just, everybody's different. Everybody's going to have a different amount of time. But for trauma, it would be checking for self-injury specifically, that you're not hurting yourself. So this might look like you're drinking too much, or you're not sleeping, or you're frequenting fast food establishments more than you should, or you're just not taking care of yourself. Could be an indicator of self-harming, for example. Isolating would be another example of self-harming. Making sure that you're in a safe environment, you're with safe people, you're not in abusive relationships, that you have resources available to you. That's a part of stabilization and regulation, but also emotional stability. And this is probably more along the lines of this group, where you're just trying to calm your body, regulate impulses, self-soothe, which is huge. Learning how to self-care more than you have ever had to work on self-care in your life in a post-trauma grief space. It is utterly essential that you are working on that self-care component. Then we have phase 2, which is coming to terms with the traumatic memories. We see a lot of this action in acceptance and commitment therapy. This work focuses on overcoming the traumatic memories. And I don't know if you remember this or not. And maybe in one of these, I'll bring my brain back where I can talk about my actual brain model that I have, or we can talk about what part of your brain has been the most impacted. But in trauma, you don't hold memories in the hippocampus in the way that you would with your other memories. So basically there's 3 parts of your brain, like power brain, right? So the first, there's this part, and this part. This part back here, and I do this because this is my amygdala and my brainstem. This is your reptilian brain. Okay, this is the first few weeks of your life in womb and in utero that's developed, and then later you develop your mammalian brain. Once you're born, your mammalian brain starts to grow, and then you have this thinking, conscious prefrontal cortex part of your brain. When you experience trauma, this shuts down. And your limbic system, like it's right here and like it's right here. That engages. That's your emotional system. And when you experience trauma, you're not going to experience memories in the same way that you would if you did not have the trauma, because your prefrontal cortex outside of trauma is engaged. When trauma is part of the equation, your frontal lobe shuts down because you either need to fight the lion or fight the bear. And so you don't need to use your prefrontal cortex for that. You just need to use your muscles. And so you run. That's your flee. You fight, you freeze, or you placate, and we say fawn. We try to make sure everything around us is organized and good, and everything around us is everybody's happy. So there's actually 4 Fs. It's not just fight or flight. It's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The final stage is integration and move on. This typically will come many months, if not several years after the traumatic event. And this is where you try to, of course, you've executed the restabilization and regulation. You've been able to come to terms with what's actually taken place. And now finally, you're to the point where you're able to integrate all of that into your day-to-day living. This is not something that happens overnight. I can't stress to you enough that this part of the 3-phased treatment comes much, 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 much later. Please work with a therapist who's not actively asking you to recall memories, unless you're working with an EMDR specialist, which is a very specialized type of therapy. It's very different and it's very appropriate in that space. If you're working with a talk therapist who's not practicing EMDR, it's actually not healthy for you to be recalling the traumatic events. If you want to journal them and you think that that's something that is good and for you, and you think that you're in that zone of therapy where you're able to start talking about those things, please know that's coming in late 2nd and 3rd stage of the treatment. So keep that in mind when and if you're seeking out psychotherapy. All right, so that's it. I want you to go ahead now and stop me and focus on your 3rd activity journal. That is page 11, Understanding the Path Ahead, where it's asking you to reflect upon your own relationship to the stages of healing from trauma. And don't forget to use those notes from our first week of class when we talked about the stages, phases, and tasks of the experience. This is specifically talking about the phases of recovery. All right, everybody, that's it for our second installment. Be blessed, and I look forward to seeing you in the third installment. Take good care. Bye-bye.